as is typically the case, we are very proud of the members of Locals that we have. There's always very high-level, provocative conversations that take place there, things that give us a lot of content, a lot of times actually, things that we do on this show, segments we do, people we interview, people we ask to be interviewed, come from our Locals members. It's not just a service that we provide, but it's really an invaluable asset for us. And then every Friday night we have this Q&A show that only works because of how wide-ranging and thoughtful and informed these questions are. We try and pick some that are about things that we've done and said previously that people have questions about, but we also answer questions about topics that we have not covered. And we're going to get through as many of them tonight as we can. The first of which is from Alan Smithy. And he asked this: Glenn, what are your thoughts on the Tucker-Fuentes feud? As a fan of all the principals, which also includes, I presume, Candace Owens, who was part of this three-way argument, conflict, feud, I'd like to believe that this is just a continuation of COINTELPRO meant to sow division amongst the anti-war crowd. But I have to admit that Nick's rebuttal was pretty damning and more substantive than the name-calling that preceded it. All right, so one of the reasons why I didn't talk about it, despite obviously being extremely interested in all three of them and the subject matter that they cover, I obviously am a longtime friend of Tucker's. I used to be on his show, I think, more than anybody else when he was on Fox News, and now on his podcast I'm on frequently. Maybe the guest who's been on the most as well, I'm not really sure. It's not competition. I don't know why I have to keep saying I'm at the top of the charts, but just to indicate the frequency. And he's been on our show before, so I definitely consider him a friend of mine. Candace, I have a good relationship. I would describe it as friendly. I've chatted with Nick over the years a little bit, certainly not near the same level of interaction. So when, I will confess, someone is your friend, and I had this issue with Matt Taibbi a lot. I was recently on Brianna Joy Gray's show, but also, no, I might have even been a different show where people were someone was trying to ask me about Matt Taibbi and some of the criticism of him. You know, it's very difficult when you are friends with somebody to, what's that? Yeah, we've gotten questions about Matt Taibbi here as well over the past few months about things like his refusal to comment on Israel and Gaza, his infrequent commentary on the First Amendment issues raised by deporting students who speak critically of Gaza, the imposition of hate speech codes on American campuses by the Trump administration to shield Israel from criticism. And I'm very honest about the fact that when someone is your friend, when you consider someone as your friend, at least for me, I really don't feel comfortable publicly criticizing them. It's actually one of the reasons why I go out of my way not to be friends or have any social ties with the people I'm supposed to be covering in Washington, politicians, major journalists. I've always thought the fact that I don't live in New York or Washington to be one of the greatest benefits for my journalism, because I'm not in the middle of their social scenes. I don't owe any social niceties to them. I don't feel as though if I criticize them, it's going to affect my social life or put me in uncomfortable positions. I don't feel I take the obligation of friendship seriously. Like, if you're actually somebody's friend, it comes with loyalty, and part of that loyalty is if you have problems with what they do and say, you go to them privately. It would take a lot for me to get to publicly criticize or down someone I consider my friend. I'm just being honest about that. Maybe that's not even the right thing to do. I'm not praising myself. I'm just telling you how I feel personally. But again, I think if you live in New York, if you live in Washington, and you're integrated into that political media world, that is one of the reasons why it's so incestuous, why they constantly cover for each other, why there's so much groupthink within it. They're always talking to each other, for each other. In order to be part of these social scenes on which they depend, you have to be welcome. Part of being welcome is that you don't stray too far from their dogma. And I've always aggressively kept a very distant arm's length from people in positions of power, from major media figures, so that I don't feel constrained about giving my honest views or critiques or analysis or reporting on them. Occasionally, you do become friends with people almost by accident who then end up in positions of power. Tulsi Gabbard is a good example. I have no problem criticizing Tulsi Gabbard because whatever good relations I've had with her before, she's now the director of national intelligence, and I'm not going to pull punches when I have critiques of Tulsi, and I'm also, going to praise her only because I feel the praise is warranted. So sometimes you just have to accept the fact that somebody has risen to a particular position or entered a type of power position, that there's just no getting around the fact that your job requires honest critique. But I don't feel like that's the case for any of the people involved here, Tucker, Candace, or Nick Fuentes. I don't feel like any of them is a government official. Obviously, they all do have a great deal of influence in very different ways. So I don't want to side with any one of them, nor do I want to necessarily say that I think insults or criticisms that they've launched at each other are warranted. But it is an extremely important conversation, so I also don't want to avoid it entirely, because for one thing, these are three people, and obviously people understand how influential Tucker and Candace are. They're, arguably the two most prominent conservative journalists / pundits, influencers. Maybe you could put Charlie Kirk in there, maybe Ben Shapiro, but Tucker and Candace are both bigger. I mean, Tucker hosted the most watched show in the history of cable news for 5 years at the 8 o'clock spot on Fox, and he's been on TV for 25 years before that. And Candace is just a powerhouse. She's a force of nature. Whatever you think of her, whatever you think of the Macron stuff, whatever you think of her Israel stuff, whatever, I'm leaving that on the side. I'm just saying, the fact of the matter is that when Candace left the Daily Wire, which of course is founded and run by Ben Shapiro, after she had a falling out with Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, the other co-founder, over her criticisms of Israel, which at the time were very mild. She was basically saying, I don't think we should be bombing and killing children. That was pretty much the extent of it that caused this massive upheaval. A lot of people wondered, well, what is she going to do? Just like people wondered what Tucker Carlson were going to do. And they both went on to become, in my view, far more influential. I'm not saying that Tucker's position in the media ecosystem now is necessarily larger than it is at the 8 o'clock spot on Fox News, but being at the 8 o'clock hour on Fox News comes with a lot of constraints, as he found out when he got fired, despite being the highest rated host on all of cable news. And he's completely liberated of those constraints now. I mean, completely. He's financially set. Fox is still paying this gigantic contract. He also now has a very successful platform. He's not worried about saying or doing whatever he wants. And I feel like he feels like, he said this before publicly, not just in our conversations, that there was a lot of things he did as part of his career that he deeply regrets. Just being part of Washington Groupthink. He was raised there. He wasn't raised technically, physically in Washington, but he eventually went there. But his, father was very integrated into the U.S. deep state, we could call it, ties to the CIA. He ran the propaganda arm of the U.S. government. Voice of America, was very, very integrated into that world. He grew up with a lot of wealth and privilege, as he will tell you. And so when he got to Washington and got on TV very early on, he really was just in the middle of, immersed in this subculture that led him to believe, or at least not even necessarily to believe, but to say a lot of things that he didn't really fully believe, or maybe that you can get yourself to believe things that you don't really believe because you just feel like it's what everyone around you expects you to say. And unlike a lot of people who were guilty of the same thing, Tucker has probably more than anybody else been extremely candid about what he regrets. And not only what he regrets, I'm not just talking about support for the Iraq War, I'm talking about the whole support that he gave for, George Bush, Dick Cheney, neoconservative ideology, and not just on foreign policy, but also on economic policy. And I think it's often overlooked. Everyone sees his heterodoxy on foreign policy. Even when he was at Fox, he was criticizing Trump for doing things like assassinating General Soleimani, saying this is not in our interest. This might be in the interest of neocons or Israel. But why would we risk a war with Iran when that's not in our interest? He was saying things like that even on Fox. Obviously, he probably was the single most influential figure that took a lot of MAGA people, a lot of people on the right, and turned them against the war in Ukraine. By every night, I was on his show dozens of times, talk about that war, to the point where when he got fired from Fox, a bunch of Republican lawmakers ran to Politico or Axios anonymously and celebrated his firing and saying, oh, now our lives are going to be much easier. We can now fund the war in Ukraine without as much public pushback. And that trajectory was because not just that he regretted what he had previously advocated and acknowledged his wrongdoing, but he was and is really determined to kind of repent for it. And he feels like the way to repent for it is by never again allowing himself to be blind. He moved out of Washington. He used to live in the middle of Georgetown around, Victoria Newland lived on, I think, down the street or the other street. I mean, that's where they all lived. And, he now lives in rural Maine. He also lives in an island off Florida. And he purposely took himself to places that are very isolated, that are completely detached from that world for the same reason as I was just describing. Not only do you feel less constrained, but you see things more clearly. Because you don't wake up every day and immediately get surrounded by people who are just part of this blob of groupthink. And so you're able to analyze things from a distance. It's sort of like if you go into a big city and you're on a street corner, the vision that you have of what the city looks like is radically different than if you fly over it, because that distance from what you're looking at gives you a better perspective, or at least maybe not even better, but different. And the same thing happens when you move out of Washington, when you move out of New York and you purposely stay away from it. You start to see things, in my view, more clearly because you're not immersed in it. And I do find that extremely valuable, what he's done. I find that trajectory very, very positive. It's one of the reasons why, despite how much, probably more than anything else that I've ever done, what caused much of the left to turn against me, not all, but much, was number one, my refusal to get on board with Russiagate, but number two, my association with Tucker. But I saw early on that there was a real movement on parts of the populist right that you're now seeing in lots of different ways, not just questioning Israel and foreign policy and war, but also corporatism and the idea of economic populism. And yes, there are lots of deviations from it, but Tucker and a few others were what made me see how real that was and how much of an opportunity there was, and not just to keep yourself in prison in the Democratic Party. So I do believe Tucker's trajectory is real. I do believe that he's sincere and genuine in what he's saying. And I know that you never know what's fully in a person's heart, not even your own heart. You can't know for certain. You can deceive yourself about your own motives, your own thoughts, even the people you're closest to, your friends. But I feel like I have enough confidence in how well I know him, not just professionally, but personally as well, the time we spent together, the time we've talked, that I do believe that he's very authentic in what he's saying. I think his trajectory is continuing. I don't think he's stopped at the point where he's going to be. And I think it's been very positive on almost every level. So that's Tucker over here. And then let's kind of put Candace in a similar position. I don't know Candace as well, so I can't comment to that degree of confidence about who she is and why she's doing what she's doing. But clearly, 2 years ago, Candace worked at the Daily Wire. 4 years ago, she was in Jerusalem with Charlie Kirk celebrating Trump's movement of the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, a long time pipe dream, what seemed like a pipe dream, of the furthest, most radicalized greater Israel fanatics and their supporters in the United States. And there was very little criticism coming from Candace about Israel. In fact, the opposite was true. But I do believe that she too, and in her case, she's a lot younger than Tucker. She's only been around for not all that long. And I know personally that when you start off doing this work and you're able to spend full time digging into things, if you're minimally a critical thinker, if you're minimally open-minded, your views are going to morph the more you learn, the more you dive into things, the more you experience things. That is healthy and normal. And I do believe that her views that she most passionately expresses, to which she pays the most attention, are genuine, which isn't the same thing as saying I agree with them all, they're all positive. I'm simply saying I believe she also believes the things she's saying. I don't think it's calculated. I don't think it's about grifting. If it were, she could have stayed at the Daily Wire. There's a lot easier ways to make a popular path than doing what she does. She defends Harvey Weinstein. She took up that case. There hardly was a public clamoring for that, especially among the audience that she cultivated. The Macron stuff, all the stuff with Israel. She's been excluded from a lot of mainstream corporate media circles to which she used to have complete access and in which she could have risen without limit. She's obviously very talented, like Tucker is as a communicator. And she chose a much harder path, and I think that was through genuine conviction. So those two you can there's a lot of differences between Tucker and Candace, but for that purpose you can put them together. And then in this conflict, you have Nick Fuentes. And just for those of you who don't know, what basically the short version of this, for those who haven't seen it, is that Nick Fuentes, I'm just going to give you this summary of what's happened in the past few months, not going back years, but Nick Fuentes is very critical often of people who seem like they're closest to him politically. So he spends a lot of time criticizing Charlie Kirk. I was going to say Ben Shapiro, but I don't think Ben Shapiro is remotely close to Nick Fuentes. But Charlie Kirk on the surface could be. He spends a lot of time criticizing Matt Walsh. And he has also, hurled a lot of criticism and might even say insults toward Candace Owen and Tucker Carlson. And in response, Candace Owen invited him for the first time on her podcast. And although I do think they have far more views and commonality than differences, the podcast was a bit hostile. And I would say it's in part because Candace had some acrimonious points to raise with him, but also because, and she played some of these clips, Nick Fuentes had, very harshly attacked her and criticized her, calling her a bitch who doesn't know what she's doing. And, if you're going to do that, the people who are your targets are not necessarily going to love you at the same time. And so this was really the triggering event. She invited him on her podcast. Obviously, got a huge audience between Candace and Nick Fuentes, who has a gigantic following online. I don't think, I'll get to that in a second. But in some ways, you could argue he's as influential these days as Candace and Tucker, and maybe headed for even surpassing them, which, again, generationally, that's natural. But because that interview was acrimonious and brought out a lot of tensions and personal conflict, and then it kind of spilled over into online because Nick left that interview and started really condemning Candace, accusing her of sandbagging him in the interview and the like, and then they had a big fight online. And then before you knew it, Tucker asked Candace to come on his podcast. So you're talking about now Candace Owens on Tucker Carlson's podcast, obviously a gigantic interview. And both of them, I don't know if they planned it beforehand, but both of them talked about Nick Fuentes in an extremely derogatory way, extremely derogatory. Tucker did acknowledge that what you cannot deny. I tell people who are friends on the left or liberals or even people more centristy who are extremely uncomfortable with Nick Fuentes, it's kind of like you can hate Trump all you want, but there's no denying his charisma, his skill in communicating, and the fact that he's very funny. For a long time, it was like heresy to say that, but there's no denying that that's true. I have no trouble admitting that people I can't stand are smart. I think Dick Cheney is very smart. I actually think Liz Cheney is very smart. Just to give two examples, a lot of other ones as well. You can acknowledge the skills and assets that people have who you dislike or even despise. Those are not inconsistent. So Tucker did acknowledge, look, Nick Fuentes is spectacularly talented. He's a very rare, generational talent in terms of his ability to go before the camera, attract attention, be charismatic. But he's not like a ranter and a raver. Nick Fuentes is very well read, very, very informed. There aren't a lot of people who know more about the topics Nick Fuentes covers than Nick Fuentes. It's very impressive. And that combination of being very charismatic, an extremely adept communicator, just kind of a natural camera presence, and having really smart insights that are grounded not in sensationalism or blind ideology, but lots of reading and thinking and critical evaluation. It's a very potent combination, and that's the reason why he's becoming so popular, that even people at the heights of Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson can't really ignore it anymore. And they talked about Nick Fuentes as though he were just sort of some loser. Like Tucker was saying, how did he become so influential? He was just this gay kid living in his mother's basement from Chicago. And I don't think Tucker quite meant it that way, but that is how some of it came off. And they also both kind of agreed that he was some sort of psyop to destroy the right, that he maybe was a Fed working for the CIA. And that led Nick to do a series of shows, a couple of segments, where he just tore into Tucker and Candace, particularly Tucker, in a way that suggests he was basically arguing, how can you possibly call me this, psyop or this operative or this person who works for the CIA when you spent your whole life inside these circles? Candace Owens was the one working for Ben Shapiro, and Tucker Carlson was working for Rupert Murdoch making millions. Nick Fuentes wasn't. And Nick's basic point was like, you're all very late to this game, like criticizing Israel, talking about the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States. You've only started doing this last year, whereas I've been doing it for years. And this is what I think is at the heart of the matter, which is that there are people who have been talking about Israel in this way for a long time. Noam Chomsky did, Norman Finkelstein did. One of the most important events was in 2007 when two of the most prestigious political scientists and international relations scholars in the United States, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, wrote that book called The Israel Lobby. And first it was an essay in the London Review of Books, and then it turned into this massive tome, this 700-page book, footnoted to the hilt, because they're scholars and they wrote the book that way. And at the time, nobody in the mainstream was willing to say that. It was pretty much confined to the left, where you were free to say it. And so at the time, I was more associated with the left, perceived as being on the left. So I was saying all these things for many years, but it wasn't all that risky for me because the political camp that people perceived that I was in, and I've always had one foot in that left-wing camp back then and one foot in the kind of libertarian, more independent camp. But in both of those camps, it was totally fine, totally even welcome to talk about why we do so much for Israel, the evils of Israel, how they control our politics, how we go to war for them, how much money we spend to support them. So wasn't taking I've taken risk in my career, but I don't consider that one that. But Nick Fuentes was, when he started doing it, was 18 years old. And he had this very promising future inside conservative media. At 18, he'd already been, spotted as a talent. He had small shows, but he was making connections with and networking some of the people who were very influential inside corporate media. And at the time, people forget because now there's a lot of space for talking this way about Israel. At the time, there was basically none. Before Donald Trump, there was almost nobody on the right willing to talk this way about Israel. You had Pat Buchanan, who did it for a long time, going back, to the 80s, and he was viciously smeared as an anti-Semite. You had Ron Paul who did it, same thing. You raised Ron Paul, you raised Pat Buchanan, anti-Semites, because they were talking this way. But it was very rare, very few and far between. And then you had Trump kind of come in and create this space, and Nick Fuentes started really looking into it. And he described on Candace's show, and he's described before how he, and I'm going into this not because of the personalities, but because I think they raise very broader issues about how all of this has evolved. Not just for them, but for the broader discourse. And he started off, in conservative politics. He at first, was thinking Israel is our greatest ally. We have to support them. All the standard Republican and conservative views that have dominated both Republican and Democratic party politics for decades. But then the more he started looking, the more he started questioning it. And the more he started questioning it, the more he started becoming vocal about it. And the more he became vocal about it, the more he became shunned inside the conservative media world that he obviously had a very bright future in. And rather than shutting up, as he was told to do, knowing that that might be better for his career, he couldn't. He just doesn't have that personality type. And he just had to keep examining it and keep saying it. And to say that Nick Fuentes paid a price for that is an understatement. Nick Fuentes got excluded and booted out of every conceivable precinct of conservative media, even ones that consider themselves radical, dissident, far-right ones. I'm talking here mainstream ones. he was physically banned from going to Charlie Kirk's Turning Points USA and lots of other conferences like that. He was fired from the media platforms he was starting to develop. He was shunned by the friends that he had made, younger people on the side of the conservative movement. And then beyond that, it escalated from there. He got banned from almost every social media platform, including X. Elon Musk eventually reinstated him once he bought X, where he now is. But basically, the only platform where he could be was on Telegram. And now he's on Rumble, because Rumble is a genuine free speech platform, and he has a show on Rumble that he does, I think, every night or 4 nights a week, and has found a good size audience. But really on Twitter is where he gets his most attention, and that's why they banned him from Twitter in the pre-Musk era. But it wasn't just that. He wasn't just silenced and banned throughout all social media, but he was also debanked. I mean, he just had bank accounts closed because of his political views by major banks in the United States. He would get rejected for banking applications. He was put on a no-fly list, which is the first time I really talked to Nick, spoke about Nick, when I raised serious concerns about no-fly lists being used in this way. And his career has been severely impeded. Not from what people believe are his racist views about black people or immigrants. Tons of people have those views and are perfectly welcome and fine in right-wing circles. The sole cause of it was his opposition to Israel and his questioning of the power of the Jewish lobby to keep the United States subservient to Israel. It just wasn't said. It was just a taboo. It was one of the third rails of American political discourse that would get anybody fired or destroyed for talking about it. And he was doing it at a time. Now a lot of people talk about it. It's become almost mainstream. But back then when he was doing it, especially on the right, almost nobody was. And he paid a huge price, personally, financially, for his career, for his reputation, for his friendships, for his ability to get bank accounts. The government even put him on no-fly list. And then last year, let's not forget, a homicidal maniac came to his house to try and murder him, who did actually shoot 2 of his neighbors and kill them, and showed up at his house with a very large automatic weapon. And he eventually ended up being killed by the police. And another woman showed up at his house, a crazy liberal woman who he had to pepper spray. So he's paid a lot of price for this. And I think, I don't want to speak for him, but I definitely identify with this mindset. I've had it too sometimes, which is that if you are the first person or one of the first people to kind of get out on that plank and you're taking the shots because of it and very few other people are willing to join you, and then at some point it becomes a little safer to do, I'm not saying it's still safe. Tucker has also paid a price for it. I mean, half his audience is turned on him. He's widely now attacked by conservatives as being an anti-Semite, a Qatari agent, Candace as well. So it's not cost-free at all. And Tucker didn't have to do it. He could have just ignored it. So he's paid a price too, but Nick Fuentes paid, there's a big difference between Tucker Carlson in his mid-50s with a gigantic multi-million dollar a year contract with Fox News coming from the family that he came from versus Nick Fuentes is a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old enduring all of that. And he comes from no wealth, no privilege. And I think the idea is Nick feels like he was out on that plank, taking all these, arrows and punishments. And then in part, I do think that he helped open the space on the right to start talking more about Israel in a more honest way. And it is true that Tucker and Candace, for the most part, hadn't really ever talked about it until after October 7th, when, as Nick says, it almost became inevitable. They could have both ignored it. They could have both, just spouted a few light lip service to it, but both of them made it very central to their cause, which they didn't have to do. It was not in their interest to do as well, but they did do it. But I think he feels like, I'm the one who actually paid the price for this. I was the one who was doing this earlier than the two of you come and now start doing it when it's a little bit safer and also you're more protected because of your platform and standing and wealth, and you want to basically throw me in the garbage, like declare me off limits, like be the gatekeeper that says you can go up to this point where Candace and I are, or where Tucker and Candace are, but you can't go to Nick Fuentes. He's way too hateful or radical or dangerous or whatever. And he feels like they're very late to the game, that he was braver, that he paid a bigger price, and then they came along at an easier time and, decided that they were the outer limits of where you can go on these discussions about Israel and the like. I'm not saying that's what I think. I'm saying that's what he thinks. I identify with that view. I think there's definitely some valid basis to why he thinks that. And sometimes that does happen. I mean, sometimes, there are people who are willing to do it when it's extremely thankless to do. The no benefits, all penalty. And then other people kind of come when it's still not safe. Like I said, it wasn't safe for Tucker and Candace to do. They're paying prices as well in lots of different ways, but not nearly as much as Nick. And I think he would be fine if they would get there and say, Nick Fuentes was one of the first people doing this. Let's welcome him on our show. But the fact that he's still excluded, the fact that, they called him a gay loser basically in his parents' basement, implied that he was working for the CIA or was an agent provocateur to destroy the right. I think that's what made him start being resentful. And also, there is this class issue here which is very real, which is, it's not his fault, but Tucker's stepmother, who Tucker's mother left them when he was very young. She went off to Europe, never really had any relationship with her. And then his father married a heiress from the Swanson fortune. And although that didn't make that fortune his, it wasn't his mother, it was his stepmother. Obviously he was living with his father and his stepmother, and they had a very good relationship. She was very good to him. And, he ended up having all these benefits from a very young age. First of great wealth and privilege, and then, some amount of fame, and then more fame, and then more wealth. And that's, more or less has been his life. Candace, I'm not sure about her, where she came from, what her family situation was, but once she got very big, she became very wealthy, and then she went to work for the Daily Wire, had a very lucrative contract there, and now she's married to, I heard Nick saying he's British royalty. I don't know if he is, maybe he is, I don't know one way or the other, but I know he's extremely wealthy. And I think there's a class issue there too, which is like, you two purport to be the kind of warriors for this group of which you're not a part, which is kind of disaffected working class white people. And Nick saying, I actually came from there. And now suddenly you two, from your great mountain of wealth and privilege and lifelong, or at least in Candace's case, years-long financial power and privilege and status and wealth, whatever, are coming in and trying to talk about me like I'm some loser. And yeah, I'm a loser in the sense that lots of white people have become trampled on by the United States, and that is supposed to be what right-wing populism cares about. So I thought it was very telling. I do think, if I'm being totally honest, it's more personal than substantive. I think Nick feels a lot of resentment for how he's been treated. I think Candace and Tucker feel resentment that they put a lot on the line to go where they went. And one of the people who has a big influential audience among especially young conservatives have kind of gone to war with them. So I think there's a lot of personal animus and personal resentment driving this, but there's also something very substantive here as well, which is about how people who are a little bit further along on the extremist train sometimes get attacked by the people who are less so, where they want to draw a line and kind of cut off the plank and have you fall off even though you were on the plank first. And I think Nick feels like that's being done to him. And I also think that there is a real class conflict that is driving a lot of this that is very much a part of the conservative world. I mean, huge amounts of conservative influencers, conservative pundits, conservative operatives who claim that they're there to speak for the working class, for disaffected white people in the United States, are hanging out with billionaires every day and being funded by billionaires and meeting with billionaires and getting invites to the White House and to every center of power. And obviously a lot of compromises are required to do that. And Nick's not willing to make them, and a lot of them are. that is a substantive issue as well. Now, Tucker and Candace, I do think they don't get very many invites to those circles. Tucker more than Candace. Tucker because he's been around for so long. He's good friends with people in the Trump administration. He campaigned for Trump. Trump likes him, even though Trump repudiated him and insulted him because of his opposition to the war in Iran. But these are a lot of tension points inside the MAGA movement that are very real, even if some of them are personal driven. We're human beings. We all harbor jealousies and vindictive sentiments and resentments. And it's a Herculean effort to try and exclude those as much as possible. We all have to try. Some of us do better than others. But none of us is immune from that. So I'm not suggesting that it's a huge character flaw. I'm just saying I do think that's part of it. But I also think at least as big of a part, if not bigger, are some of these ideological and class issues who's sort of keeping one foot in decent society and who's willing to say fully what they think without it. And then the last thing I'll say is, and this is sort of, what I began by saying, which is you can like somebody or not, but it doesn't mean you should lie about their skills or their successes. Nick Fuentes had a big online following for a few years, but it was very much a kind of online following that was almost like a cult following. It was like a very idiosyncratic group of people. They called themselves the Groypers. They didn't have a lot of cachet or influence outside of their circles, in part because Nick Fuentes wasn't invited on anywhere into those more mainstream circles or even less mainstream far-right circles. He kind of built his entire world himself. And because of a combination of his undeniable talent and charisma, and I want to stress again, I think Nick Fuentes is, of all the there's tons of successful podcasters and influencers who really don't have an original thought. They know what they have to get up and say to validate their audience, to show their loyalty to a particular circle. They may even have some talent in terms of rhetoric and communication, some online, some charisma, but they're not very critically minded. They don't do a lot of reading. I can't tell you how often I listen to some of the podcasters with the biggest audiences, even on issues that they cover a lot, and you listen to them and you're just like, how are you so ignorant? How do you think these things? Do you ever stop and breathe and reflect or read anything? Read anything substantive in or bound like a Wikipedia page? So there's a lot of that. And obviously there's a ton of that in corporate media too. But Nick Fuentes go listen to him if you haven't. And if you have preconceptions about what he is. I'm not saying that he doesn't say things that are provocative and deliberately he crosses lines on purpose sometimes when he doesn't need to, just to cross them. Though I do think it's often purposeful. It's not just about, a teenage transgressive instinct. So there are definitely things he said that are, offensive, genuinely so. And not offensive in that, oh my God, you've offended me, but things that I think he would even acknowledge. He often says he doesn't really mean it. He is prone to rhetorical excess, and it's part of the whole presence. But everything that he talks about are things that he is extremely knowledgeable of and well-versed in. And most of all, I think Nick Fuentes sometimes people just find success because they've done the right thing at the right time. And I think there is a huge awakening after October 7th, because although Nick was talking about it before that, and a lot of other people were too, Israel really hasn't been on the front burner of American political discourse for quite some time. You have to go maybe back to 2018 when people in Gaza decided they were going to engage in nonviolent symbolic protest of doing a peaceful nonviolent march to the border wall with Israel to demonstrate that they are basically living in a prison and can't get out. And despite the fact that it was fully nonviolent, the IDF came and just started murdering them with snipers, just blowing their heads off, shooting them in the chest, shooting teenagers in the chest. And there was some attention paid to that. Really, the last time, every year, including 2023 before October 7th, as we covered last night, Israel goes in, kills random people in Gaza and the West Bank, bombs them, shoots at them, murders them. But the last time they really did it on a scale, I don't want to say like they're doing now because nothing is like now, but on a real major scale, sustained bombing was in 2014 when Obama was president. That was the last time when Israel really was at the front burner. So it's a long time, 10 years, 11 years. You have a lot of people who, if they're in their 20s, were nowhere near enough to have been at the age where they would pay attention to that, the way they would care about that. Even, into your 30s, I mean, there's a lot of people who only got politicized in the last, since Trump. And this is the first look they're getting at Israel and the true face of it, but also, more importantly, to a lot of people, the real relationship between the United States and Israel's ability to exert almost unparalleled power inside the United States, to censor, to punish, to destroy reputations, to destroy politicians who don't serve Israel. And that has opened up a huge... I was on Matt Gaetz' show last night, and I had Matt Gaetz on my show before. He wasn't talking critically about Israel, but he had me on, and we spent the first, 30, 35, 40 minutes talking about the evils of Israel, of AIPAC, of Israeli influence in Congress. He told stories about when he was in Congress of things he saw. This was Donald Trump's pick to be the Attorney General just 6 months ago. So you see how much... And then Marjorie Taylor Greene is way out there now on AIPAC, to her credit. And so you can see how this is really opened up. And when that happens, whoever's there first and doing it at a time before it opens up, before it's safe, before it's easy, is going to have a lot of credibility on that topic because they were doing it before everybody else was. And that also is kind of what has made this Nick Fuentes' moment. And I don't care how excluded he is, how banned he is, especially among young conservatives. Probably overwhelmingly young conservative men, though I don't know exactly what his demographic is, but I imagine. But that's an important demographic. It's a big, influential demographic. He is, I would say, for conservatives under, 30, 35, 30, arguably the single most influential and admired conservative influencer, right-wing, far-right influencer, whatever you want to call him. And people are going to have to accept that. People are going to have to grapple with that. People are going to have to confront that because that is a reality. And I think people who are worried about it, who think it's dangerous, whatever, really have no one to blame but themselves. How long do we have to learn the lesson that if you try and suppress things and ideas and people through censorship, through punishment, through silencing, through exclusion, you're just going to make them stronger? You can kill them, you can imprison them, but short of that, at some point people are going to say, wait a minute, why is this so taboo? Who declared this all off limits? Who declared this so dangerous that we're not allowed to even hear from it? Especially in the United States, where we're inculcated with this kind of anti-authoritarian sentiment that whoever tells you what you can and can't say, that there's certain things you can't hear. There's kind of a defiant attitude that almost emerges instinctively, at least among healthy people. It does. There's a lot of Americans, pounded into submission, into accepting whatever. But I'm saying there's still that American spirit that I think is one of the great things about the United States, just kind of like, no, you're not going to decide what we think and what we can listen to and what we can hear. And when you have someone like Nick Fuentes, who they've tried to do everything to destroy and crush and silence because it was used on this one issue, who now breaks through because of a free internet, because Elon put him back on X, because he has Rumble, where you can do a show. You don't need much more than that. And, Fox News is, like all cable networks, dying. They have 70-year-old people watching it, pretty much exclusively. And it's not exactly a novel observation that people now get their views and ideas and the people they listen to and trust from the internet, from social media, from podcasts, from shows. And he is one of the most influential and formidable figures in conservative discourse, and people can deny that. I'm sure there are a lot of people wanting to, but that's just the reality. And I think it's only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because of all the reasons I've said. So I think a lot of this conflict between Tucker and Candace on the one hand, Nick Fuentes on the other, You can put Charlie Kirk, who's had wars with Nick Fuentes, Matt Walsh. It's a lot of it is because of these more substantive, interesting dynamics that I think merit a lot of thought in terms of conservative influencing, conservative discourse, but also our broader discourse as well about what had always been over a line and what is no longer over the red line, because people are starting to get resentful at the people who drew the red lines. And you have more credibility if you're over that red line than if you're too scared to cross it. And whatever you want to say about Nick Fuentes, he's crossed those red lines many times without much fear, and that's given him a great deal of credibility among increasingly large numbers of people. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.